So today I want to go over a variation of the Druid Tornado build using the new Druid unique weapon, and this is going to be on the Eternal Realms, so if you're somebody that doesn't want to play in Seasons, this build will work fine for you, but I'll also go over the Malignant Hearts that I think you should be using for this build, so if you want to come back and use this build once you progress into the end game on the Seasonal Realms, you can do that as well. Now one of the main variations of this build is going to be using the new Druid unique weapon called the Flesh Render, and the special effect is Debilitating Roar and Blood Howl deal a burst of damage to nearby poisoned enemies. And with this build, everything's going to be poisoned, and we're going to be able to spam Debilitating Roar and Blood Howl quite a bit. So this is going to be quite a lot of additional AoE damage. Now you can get a lot more damage scaling if you have a better rolled version of this weapon, because I got a middling damage roll from the roll range itself, but the item level this weapon drops as dictates the damage roll range. So I have a 789 and that goes up to 3981, but this can go up to 820. So if you get a 820 item level as the drop roll of this, your damage values are going to be much higher. So you could very easily double or more than double the damage of this damage proc. And keep in mind, this is a flat value, so this is pre any scaling. And this burst of damage does also get some of our damage scaling. So for instance, in basically every Druid build, you're using Grizzly Rage, and you're using the legendary aspect that WoW and Grizzly Rage, your critical strikes give you critical strike damage that stacks. The burst of damage from this weapon gets that damage stacking. So I've seen hits of this damage proc hit for over 1,000,000 because I had so much stacked up damage. Then we're going into our skill tree, and I've changed from Storm Strike over to Wind Shear just because I want a range generator, since Storm Strike's damage reduction got pretty heavily nerfed. Then upgrade 1, Wind Shear can cause enemies to become vulnerable. Then we're going down 5 points in a Tornado, our main damaging ability. Upgrade 1 has a chance to spawn an additional Tornado when casting Tornado. Upgrade 2, Tornadoes can cause enemies to become vulnerable. Then we're going down taking our defensives. We're taking Blood Howl, which is just a heal, and in this build is going to be causing a burst of AoE damage. Upgrade 1, kills reduce the cooldown by 1 second, which is going to be very good for this build because now we can spam Blood Howl, get a lot more of that AoE damage. And then upgrade 2 increases our attack speed, which is also meaning we're going to want to be spamming Blood Howl. So Blood Howl is not only going to be buffing us, healing us, it's also going to be doing some big AoE damage now. Then we're taking Debilitating Roar. Upgrade 1 fortifies you, upgrade 2 heals you over the duration of the effect. So now Debilitating Roar is going to be reducing enemies damage, doing a big burst of AoE damage, fortifying us, and healing us for quite a lot. Then we're going down taking Hurricane. 1 point into this. This is primarily going to be for proccing other effects. Upgrade 1 slows, upgrade 2 causes enemies to deal less damage. Then we're going down taking Grizzly Rage, one of the main parts of this build. Basically gives us increases to everything. Upgrade 1 causes us to be unstoppable for 6 seconds. With the most recent patch, this was very heavily nerfed. So instead of being unstoppable for the whole duration, it's just the 6 seconds. This is one of the biggest nerfs specifically to this build. Then upgrade 2, it fortifies us every second it's active. Then for our capstone, we're taking Earthern Might, which is a lucky hit, has a 5% chance to restore all of your spirit and cause all of your attacks to be guaranteed crits. Then this chance is doubled on crits or when the target is immobilized, stunned, or knocked back. Then for our passives, 1 into Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more but deal more damage. Then we're going down taking 3 into Predatory Instinct, increase critical strike damage to close enemies. This will help because if enemies are close, they're usually enemies that aren't dying as quickly. Then we're taking 3 into increased movement speed while in werewolf form. Then 1 into Ancestral Fortitude to get Vigilance, damage reduction after using a defensive skill. And with this build, this is going to be up basically 100% of the time because we want to spam both our defensives as much as possible. Then we're going down taking 1 into Elemental Exposure. Storm skills have a lucky hit to cause enemies to become vulnerable. Then we're taking 3 points in an Endless Tempest, increase the duration of Hurricane. This is primarily so our Hurricane can continue to proc other effects. Then we're going down taking 3 into Neurotoxin. Poison enemies are slowed. All enemies are going to be poisoned, so this lets us kite enemies much more easily. 1 into Toxic Claws, so all of our werewolf crits cause enemies to become poisoned. We don't care about the poison damage, we just care that the enemies are poisoned, which will proc ridiculous amounts of effects in our build, including the effect of our unique weapon. Then 3 into Envenom. You gain increased critical strike damage against poisoned enemies. We also have 3 on our necklace, so it's 60% increased critical strike damage. Then we're going down taking 3 into Defiance, increased damage against elites. 3 into Circle of Life, skills that consume spirit heal you for 3% of your maximum life. We're going 3 into this because our main healing was nerfed, but with this build you you still have a ridiculous amount of healing. And then we're going down, taking 1 into defensive posture, 1 into nature's resolve. This is primarily to get unrestrained. Reduces the duration of crowd controlling effects by 9%. Triple this if you have fortify over 50% of your max life. So this is going to be tripled basically all the time. So we're getting some pretty massive reduction to crowd controlling effects. This is primarily because of the nerf to Grizzly Rage. So now the only unstoppable we have is the first 6 seconds of Grizzly Rage, where we're taking reductions in crowd control effects to try to compensate for that. Next up, we have our Spirit Boons. Now we're using Advantageous Beast to reduce the duration of control of pairing effects by 15%. This is because of the massive unstoppable nerf to Grizzly Rage. Then we're taking Swooping Attacks for attack speed increase, Calamity to extend the duration of our ultimates. We're still taking Masochistic, Critical Strikes with shapeshifting skills, heal you for 3% of your max life, but now this is nerfed to a lucky hit, up to a 75% chance as a lucky hit. This was a massive nerf to healing, but with this build, we have quite a lot of healing still. So it's not the biggest of deal with this specific variation. Then Call Before the Storm, lucky hit, nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate, just to be able to stay in Grizzly Rage as long as possible. Next up, we have our Paragon Boards, and we're primarily going to be looking at the board selection and the glyph selection, but I'll have a link to a build planner in the description if you want to follow every single one of my points. On the first board, we're taking Werewolf, increase damage while in Werewolf, take reduced damage while in Werewolf. Then the first board is going to be Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 Spirit, you deal increased damage for 5 seconds. Then the glyph we're taking is Spirit. This did get a pretty big buff. It used to be critical strike damage only to core skills. Now it's just critical strike damage. Then the secondary effect, critical strikes increase the damage an enemy takes from you by 2% up to 12%. And I don't have a lot of points into this glyph area. I am curious to see if this would be better to put a lot more points into it now because it was so heavily buffed. Then we're going up, we're taking the Thunderstruck node. Storm skills deal 30% increased critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies. And the glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, which increases the bonus to all magic nodes within range. Then the secondary is nature skills deal 10% increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Now, one of the biggest reasons you take glyphs like this is because you can put points into the stat increases. So you're going to want to take all magic nodes within range. We'll get some increased storm skill damage, some decent damage reduction against vulnerable enemies. You can either remove or add more points to the stat increases within range of this glyph, because 1 point will give you 17 dexterity or intelligence. I have all points into this so I can get more secondary effects of rare nodes throughout our boards. Then we're going up to the right of this, taking Constricting Tendrils, but we're not taking the node itself, and we're taking the Exploit glyph primarily because we want the secondary effect. Whenever you damage an enemy, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, 20-second cooldown per enemy. And if you're a lower level, take Exploit on the starting board because you can get the secondary effect of Exploit, which is the main thing you want on the starter board, with Exploit being level 1. You can get enough dexterity within range to get the secondary effect. But then we're going to go back down to the Ancestral Guidance node and go over to the right. We're taking Lust for Carnage, critical strike with Werewolf skills restore 2 Spirit. And if you're a lower level, you're going to want to take this board first. It's incredibly strong, gives you a lot of Spirit. Then the glyph is Undaunted, massively increased damage while fortified, and then damage reduction while fortified. And then we're going down and taking the Heightened Malice node. While there are 3 or more poison enemies nearby, you deal 45% increased damage, massive damage increase. I think this is one of the biggest damage increases for any legendary node in the game. So if you're a lower level, take this as your second board behind Lust for Carnage. And then next up, we have our uniques and our legendary aspects. Now for this version of the build, I'm using 3 uniques. And with this variation, you're gonna need the weapon and you're gonna need Tempest Roar. I am also using Mad Wolf's Glee. You don't need this. If you don't have this, just use a legendary chest piece and use all defensive stats. I like this with this version of the build because it is more of a speed running build, and this chest piece gives more movement speed, and +3 ranks to all werewolf skills is actually really strong. This recently got buffed from +2 to +3, and with this chest piece having stats that weren't nerfed, this chest piece is actually much stronger than it used to be. And our uniques are the new weapon that we already went over, Tempest Roar, a lucky hit for storm skills to restore spirit, and your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills. This is required. And Mad Wolf's Glee, +3 ranks to all werewolf skills. This is also going to give us plus ranks to our defensive skills, and specifically for Debilitating Roar, that will reduce the cooldown, which synergizes with our new unique weapon. Then our aspect on our necklace, Grizzly Rage shapeshifts you into a dire werewolf, gives you move speed instead of damage reduction, but the main thing we want is gives us up to 75% spirit cost reduction. Being on our necklace gives us enough spirit cost reduction to basically infinitely spam Tornado while in Grisly Rage. Our other ring increases the duration of Grisly Rage by 5 seconds. Then critical strikes increase our critical strike damage. This stacks. This is our biggest damage increase of the entirety of the build. And like we went over, the critical strike damage stacking of this will also affect our damage burst from our new unique weapon. So we can get some pretty massive damage bursts using Blood Howl or Debilitating Roar. Then our other ring, the Earthen Might key passive, also applies to your storm skills. This is required for our Earthen Might capstone to actually work. Then on our offhand, your core skills deal up to 40% increased damage based on your fortify. This is multiplicative scaling, so this is some massive damage increase. Then on our gloves, critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 25% for 5 seconds. This is going to be procced 100% of the time. In the legendary aspect we lost with this variation of the build because we're using the unique weapon was the aspect that your tornadoes now seek up to 3 enemies, so you're going to need to aim your tornadoes better, but it's not that big of a deal. That was the least important aspect of other variations of this build. Then on our legs, we have Disobedience, stacking armor. This was massively nerfed from up to 50% to now up to 30%, but it's still one of the best defensive aspects in the game. Then on our boots, we have another change. Debilitating Roar is now a werewolf skill. In addition, Debilitating Roar will immobilize poison enemies for up to 4 seconds. Now we're using this because we are now a werewolf while in Grisly Rage because of our other aspect, and we want to be able to use Debilitating Roar while in werewolf form, and the immobilize from this is also pretty nice. You'll pop Debilitating Roar, it'll immobilize all poison enemies, and because of our unique weapon, it'll do a big burst of damage as well. So our Debilitating Roar actually does a ridiculous amount of different effects. And then next up we have our gems and our stats. In our weapons, you're going to want critical strike to vulnerable enemies. In our gear, you want damage reduction while fortified. In your jewelry, you want armor, or if you're playing this in the season, you're going to want some of the new hearts. We'll go over that later in the video. Now, since stats were so heavily nerfed in the most recent patch, I still don't know what the best stats are going to be, so I'm just using these stats as if it was before the patch basically, but there may be more optimized stats when there's been a lot more testing done, and I'm using 3 uniques so you can't change the stats of those. But with Flesh Render, the stats on this are actually decent because it's using a lot of stats that weren't nerfed. So 3 ranks to defensive skills, we want to be spamming our defensives to get the damage procs. Damage while healthy was not nerfed, and I think this may be one of the better DPS stats now. Damage to poison enemies wasn't nerfed, and damage while shapeshifted wasn't nerfed. And then this also has overpower as its implicit, which also wasn't nerfed. So the stats on this are decent. On our necklace, you're going to want movement speed, damage reduction while fortified, and ranks to Envenom. We have werewolf skill damage, which is better comparatively now, but you could also get spear cost reduction. Then on our rings, you're probably still going to want critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, maximum life, and probably still vulnerable damage, which I don't have on this ring. But on this ring is basically best rolled: critical strike, vulnerable damage, lucky hit, max life. Vulnerable damage was pretty heavily nerfed, but it's probably still going to be one of the best stats. Then on our gloves, attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance. I have a willpower roll. You would primarily want plus ranks to your tornado, which would be a big damage increase for this build. Then on our legs, you still want all damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from poison, damage reduction while fortified. I just have damage reduction because I've rolled this way too many times, but you want damage reduction while injured. That was a damage reduction stat that was not nerfed, so damage reduction while injured is going to be one of the best rolls for your legs and for your boots. And my boots are basically best rolled: movement speed, total armor and werewolf, dodge chance, and damage reduction while injured. Those are basically the main stats you're going to want to be rolling. Now the new seasonal mechanic are the Malignant Hearts, which is going to go in your jewelry, so your amulet and both your rings. There hasn't been a ton of testing to see what's actually going to be the best, but if you're going to be using this build on the seasonal realms, these are the hearts that I think are going to be really strong for this build. First off, critical strikes electrically charge an enemy, causing lightning to arc between them and any other charged enemies, dealing lightning damage. Now this is incredibly strong. Basically how it works is when you critically strike enemies, they become charged with lightning, and when you critically strike any charged enemies, it arcs lightning to all charged enemies. So for a tornado build that's constantly hitting an AoE, constantly hitting a bunch of additional hits, and with really high crit chance, this will just be arcing lightning ridiculously often between enemies. And what I've seen from testing this specific heart is that these different lightning strikes that arc between enemies seem to have their own chance to be a lucky hit. Currently leveling a druid through season 1, this heart is actually causing me to get more lucky hit procs than as a level 100 druid with massively increased lucky hit chance. So I think this heart is going to be ridiculous for this build. Then we're using the Wrathful Heart that when you are hit by a stun, freeze, or knockdown, there is up to a 60% chance to automatically activate Grizzly Rage for 3 seconds. Now this is going to be so good because if Grizzly Rage is activated by this, you'll also get 6 seconds of Unstoppable. So you have a over 50% chance, if you get a good roll, when you're CC'd to activate Grizzly Rage, which will instantly make you unstoppable for 6 seconds. This will be of massive help because Grizzly Rage's Unstoppable was heavily nerfed. So this will help with that aspect of the build. And this is a Wrathful Heart, so it can go in any color. Then we're going to be using Tempting Fate. You gain up to 60% critical strike damage, but your non-crits 20 to 15% less damage. But with this build, we have ridiculously high critical strike chance. And then anytime our Capstone procs, we have 100% critical strike chance. So I think this will be overall a pretty big damage boost. But that's the entirety of this build. I think this is a pretty fun build to use. Can be used on the Eternal Realms or it can be used on the Season 1 realms, and I think it'll be better on the Seasonal realm. But I just wanted to use the new unique weapon in a build, and it seems to be a very strong variation of this build, giving a little bit of a different playstyle, adding in a little bit of something different. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
You. I'm out of spirits. I must wait a moment.